Hey again, we're getting started today with Chapter 2, the Constitution and its Origins. The U.S. Constitution is one of the world's most enduring symbols of democracy, or I should probably say a democratic republic, but more on that later. Our U.S. Constitution is the oldest and one of the shortest written constitutions of the modern era that's still in existence today. In a lot of ways, our Constitution didn't just pop out of nowhere. It's the culmination of a long history of political philosophy and thought and tradition, going even way back to Great Britain in the 1200s. So we'll get into a little bit of that historical context today, and then we'll look at kind of the first, second constitutional conventions. We will look a little bit at the Articles of Confederation, which you can think of as maybe like a rough draft for the Constitution that was eventually written. And we will also take a look at some of the pragmatic compromises that a lot of our founders had to make in order for the Constitution to get ratified in the first place. Now first, I said we'd get a little bit into our historical context here. So you might remember, Thomas Jefferson was a big proponent of claiming that we all had the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but he kind of borrowed that idea from a very important political philosopher named John Locke, who was writing in the 1600s. So a lot of our founding fathers were really influenced by John Locke and his political philosophy. Think of, when a lot of our founding fathers were growing up throughout like the 1700s, so they all had access to, Locke's thoughts and philosophy and his book, the Second Treatise of Government. So Locke is known for a lot of things. If you're in my class, you can click into the supplemental readings chapter or link for chapter 2, and there is a brief kind of recap of a lot of John Locke's ideas. For one thing I didn't mention, I don't think in this PowerPoint, is in his political philosophy, he was a proponent that governments should have a kind of system of check and balances with a separate judicial, executive, and legislative branch. He was also a proponent of what we call natural rights. So he writes about like way back in the beginning of the evolution of man and woman, that we were hunter-gatherers. We weren't necessarily settled in one location. We lived with our close-knit kinship groups with small communities where we knew everyone. And when you had kind of those smaller, less settled communities, you didn't necessarily need like a formal system of government, because everyone kind of just like fell into line with traditional norms and ways of doing things. But as society kind of progressed, as we started to settle in small towns, which developed into cities and then major metropolises, that Locke said, well, all of a sudden we're living in these huge settlements, essentially, with all sorts of people who aren't related to us. We pass people every day on the street who we don't know what their name is. We've never seen them before. We might never see them again. And he said, once we get to the point in our society where we're living in such a way, government kind of becomes a necessity, whether we like it or not. We need some system of law and order that will, and this is the key for Locke, that will guarantee our natural rights. So Locke said that as this quote on the slide says, all men by nature are equal in that equal right that every man hath to his natural freedom, without being subjected to the will or authority of any other man, being all equal and independent. No one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So, to put it more succinctly, he essentially claimed that for him at the time, all men were born with these God-given rights, these natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Now I'm going to rewind just a little bit back to the year 1215. So John Locke wasn't the first person to come up with these concepts of life, liberty, and property. You may remember from like your middle school, elementary class, reading about the Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta actually is kind of the first major document, we could maybe call it a constitution of sorts, which laid out the rights of citizens under King John during the early 1200s. So, a little backstory here. And again, if you're in my Blackboard class, you can click into the videos link for Chapter 2. There's a short video on how the Magna Carta came about. But in short, King John was no saint. He was not a very good king. People did not really like him. He was kind of a tyrant, and a very kind of brutal tyrant in many ways. So what happened was a lot of the wealthy aristocrats, what we call the barons during the time, they kind of rose up against King John because he was just making some really interesting decisions with how he was treating his people. And the barons were not very happy with it. So they went to King John and said, look, either we're going to fight you endlessly, or we're going to need to get a document together that will list some sort of limitation on your power, some sort of standard for how we are going to be treated as your subjects. And this eventually resulted in the Magna Carta. So one of the things that was listed in there is that people have these rights to life, liberty, and property, and that the king should guarantee them. And another thing that's found in there is that people should have a right to a fair trial by a jury of their peers. So two kind of things that we still expect out of our government today. Now, the one thing about the Magna Carta is it didn't last very long. King John, essentially, he signed it, but kind of under pressure, and then he went to the Pope at the time, I think it was Pope Innocent III, and he was like, well, if you know about your history during this time, the kings were pretty much ordained by God, and the Pope said who, kind of had the final word on laws and who could be king or not. And so King John went to the Pope at the time and was like, hey, these barons, they kind of forced me into signing this Magna Carta, and actually I don't really like it, and I don't want to be held to it anymore. So Pope Innocent was like, I got you, bro. And he made a proclamation and said, yeah, Magna Carta is considered null and void. We're not doing that anymore. Cool. All right. Back to this. So the point here is that, the Magna Carta was a very important historical document. It's kind of the first time that in Great Britain that, the rights of citizens or the subjects, at least the wealthy subjects, the free ones, were kind of listed out and they were to be guaranteed by the king. However, King John himself, with the help of the Pope at the time, got rid of the Magna Carta shortly after signing it, and the king afterward, put it back into effect. But the whole point was it was up to the king or the Pope whether the Magna Carta, was in effect or not. On the other hand, John Locke said, no, our rights to life, liberty, and property are not to be granted by some king or the Pope or whoever. These are God-given rights. Nobody can take these away from us. They are guaranteed and we want them written into a permanent law, not something that can be erased, put back into effect, back, forth, back, forth. So, thus, we have kind of this negation of this idea of the divine right of kings, and Locke instead claimed, like, no, God does not ordain our government. God has a role in our lives, but it's actually human beings who create and perpetuate our form of government. We create it, we keep our leaders in check, and we make sure that our natural rights are protected. And he said the way to make sure our rights are protected is by writing what he called a social contract, which was like a contract you would write up if you're in business with a new business partner or a client, right? You put everything in writing, everybody signs on and says, yes, we agree to this contract, and then you're held to it. So, John Locke and social contract theory, as I said before, at a certain point in society's growth and expansion, government becomes a practical necessity. We have to have some common institution and law that holds us together and keeps everyone in check, even people in power. And the ultimate purpose of government for John Locke is to maintain and protect the citizens' natural rights to, again, life, liberty, and property. So the government for Locke, it's not ultimately held in the hands of like the Pope or a king. It is in the hands of the people. And essentially every social contract is a negotiation between the people. How much of their power are they willing to, give up or surrender to the government in exchange for, the protection of their natural rights and a sense of order in society. So for John Locke, he felt government should be fairly limited. If the government was overstepping its boundaries and no longer protecting life, liberty, and property, then the government was breaking the social contract, essentially. So, because of this, he said governmental power is conditional and contractual. If they go outside the bounds of what's written in that social contract, then the people can consider the contract broken and they can demand a new government, or, in our case, put forth an American Revolution. Voila, which brings us to a little history recap. Now, if you've taken American history lately, then this will be a lot of just review of stuff you already know. If it's been a while, maybe a lot of this will jog your memory. So we're going to go over some catalysts of the American Revolution, major happenings, battles, protests that led eventually to kind of the culmination of the American Revolution. So, for most of the time before leading up to 1776, the colonists had been pretty happy. They were satisfied for the most part to be colonists. There was, think of Great Britain at the time. Great Britain had been settled for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. There wasn't that much more land to go around or property. There weren't that many opportunities to move up in society. So when the opportunity arose, like, hey, get on a boat, sail across the Atlantic Ocean in the 16 or 1700s, and you can, go settle in the New World. And over there, there's lots of land. There's a lot of opportunity. So a lot of the colonists, they were pretty happy at first, right, for a while. Generally, every colony had its own kind of system of trustees. That's a whole other story. Basically, like overlords from Great Britain who looked over each colony. So each colonial experience was a little different, but generally each colony, had its own legislature, And at least at a very local level, they were able to kind of self-govern. They elected their own leaders. Taxes, they had taxes, but they were kept pretty low for the most part. And as I said, property ownership was very widespread. Here in Georgia, if you moved to Georgia early on in the settlement of the colony, you could essentially get unlimited amounts of land for free, which was very different than what you were experiencing back in Great Britain. So this brings us to, the lead up here to 1776. So again, a little world history recap shortened up for you. The 7 Years' War, which actually was like a 9 years war, but we're going to call it a 7 years war, between Great Britain and France, finally kind of ended and came to the fore in 1763. This was essentially like a territorial conflict between France and Great Britain, not just in the New World, so to speak, but also in other territories around the globe. But they were, in particular, fighting over some of the Western territories, or what at that point were thought of as the Western territories in the U.S. Great Britain did eventually come out of that war as the victor, but the colonists, and this is kind of one seed of discontention that started out kind of our process to revolution here. When the British won that war, a lot of the colonists were like, yay, we can start moving westward. That frontier mentality had already really kind of had its seeds way back then. But the British at the time were very conscious of respecting Native American treaties, and they didn't want to encroach too much on those lands. Some agreements had been made, and they were trying to honor them. But of course, a lot of the colonists were not very happy with that. They wanted to move west. All right, so as with a lot of wars, maybe every war, usually after a war is fought, there are debts to be paid. So after that 7 Years' War, Great Britain was in quite a bit of debt. And a lot of the Parliament and the British people felt that since a good chunk of that war was fought in the New World, over in the colonies, and the lands to the west of them, then it was only fair to have a lot of the colonists pay a good chunk of that war debt, or help to pay it off. So the Parliament decided, okay, well, how are we going to do that? Well, here's a few ways. First, they started to require American colonists to pay not in paper currency, but in silver or gold. And a lot of the colonists started to smuggle goods because of that requirement, and so Britain then mandated that if you were arrested for smuggling or suspected smuggling, you would be tried in a court without a jury. Now, jury trials were a pretty long established tradition throughout British history. Remember, they even instituted it in the Magna Carta in the 1200s. So the colonists were pretty angry with that. They're like, how dare you take away our jury trials? And Britain, of course, we know this part, they started to impose a lot of direct taxes on individuals. And as our picture over here says, and I'm sure as you've heard this slogan time and time and time again, the colonists were very angry that they were being taxed without representation. Meaning, our colonists did not have a vote in who sat in the British Parliament or the British legislature who were making all of these laws about taxing the colonists. So it's not necessarily taxes in and of themselves that the colonists were mad about, but definitely the fact that they had no say, no vote in who the elected officials were who were imposing these taxes on them. So the first big tax that got the colonists hot and bothered was called the Stamp Act back in 1765. And, this is before the internet, right? So remember, everything was on paper. Anything you did in work, business, even in your leisure time, in your playtime, everything was on paper. So your diplomas, land deeds, contracts, newspapers, magazines, playing cards, everything. All of a sudden, after the Stamp Act was passed, you couldn't print your own paper in the colonies anymore. You had to purchase paper with a kind of British revenue stamp on it, with a special, as the act is called, a special stamp placed up in the corner, and everything that was printed had to be printed on that paper, and it had to be paid for in British currency. So there was a big revolt against this almost immediately because, again, paper was like, everyone used it every single day. So it was pretty quickly repealed, but the British were like, well, we still have to pay back this war debt. What's another way we can do it? So then they started to introduce what we call the Townshend Acts in 1967. Again, though, they were taxing kind of everyday items: glass, tea, which we'll come back to, and paint. Remember, again, this is before plastic was a thing, so glass was an everyday item for anything you needed to do, really. Every household had, glass containers or dishes in it. It's an everyday necessity. So, January 1768, the boycotts begin. Kind of starting out in Massachusetts. A whole lot of this hot pot of discontent started in Massachusetts, which we'll get back to, but also branched out Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York, and they started to boycott British goods. The British were like, oh, that's not going to work. We're trying to pay back these war debts. So they sent 2,000 troops to quell the unrest in Boston, which leads to two very, very renowned events. You've probably heard about these for many, many years throughout your schooling. But quick recap, in 1770, we get the Boston Massacre. The people of Boston, Massachusetts, were quite upset over all of these taxes, and they were kind of regularly meeting, assembling to discuss their grievances, and regularly protesting outside of government buildings to make their voices heard. So this day, March 5th, 1770, the colonists were protesting outside of the Boston Customs House, which is essentially like a tax official office, and altercations erupted between the armed British soldiers and the protesters. British soldiers started shooting into the crowd, and several people were shot. 3 died immediately. So this became kind of a rallying cry, like it's not just taxes now, they're not just taking us off to court without a jury, now they are literally, trying to put us down. So in kind of the intermediate period here after the massacre, the British Parliament was like, okay, maybe we need to cut back on some of these taxes here. So they got rid of, the tax on glass, the tax on paint, but the tax on tea, it stayed in effect. And at this point in time, tea was like a really big thing. We didn't have Coca-Cola yet, but think of tea as like the Coca-Cola of this time. The average colonist was drinking like 300 glasses of tea a year. So a whole lot of tea, kind of a day in, day out regular thing. So if you're going to tax tea on the colonists, that's going to affect them on a daily basis. So they were still pretty upset over this continued tax on tea, And you know this part, there was a big protest, the Boston Tea Party, is what we call it today. In December 1773, a group of Boston colonists, or colonial citizens, they actually dressed up like Native Americans, a lot of them, but they kind of boarded a ship that was full of like 300 cases of tea in the Boston harbor and just threw it overboard, just completely wasted it into the harbor. And it was owned by the British East India Company, who essentially had a monopoly on tea at the time. And in exchange, well, we'll get to this on the next slide. This kind of got the Parliament and the King George III at the time, pretty angry with the colonists because they had wasted a whole bunch of their product and a whole bunch of their money. So this is when we get the coercive acts or the intolerable acts coming into effect. And if you read the Declaration of Independence like I suggested last week, then you might remember some of these grievances from our declaration. So in response, after the Boston Tea Party, the British kind of kicked out the local officials and appointed their own governor to run Massachusetts. They banned the colonists in Massachusetts from even like meeting together, congregating to talk about their grievances. So they were not allowed to even, discuss, official business together or to govern themselves anymore. The harbor was closed down, and the Parliament essentially said, we're keeping it closed until you pay us back for all that tea you threw into the sea. The colonists never paid that back, by the way. And the British troops were allowed to occupy buildings that weren't being used. That's a little foreshadowing for our Third Amendment eventually here. And British officials who were charged with capital crimes could be tried in another colony, or they would be shipped over back to England where they would get a very friendly trial. So fairly promptly, some of our founding fathers here, they were like, all right, enough's enough. And they held the First Continental Congress in 1774, where they started to really discuss, hey, the social contract is broken here, if there ever really was one. So we're going to need to start maybe thinking about a rebellion, maybe a revolution, maybe forming our own government here. 12 of the 13 colonies attended this. Georgia was actually a notable absent colony because at the time Georgia had a fairly weak militia, and there was a pretty big Native American uprising at the time, I believe from the Creek tribe, and the governor of Georgia at the time essentially was like, hey, we support, this whole independence thing, but, logistically at the moment, we kind of need the British military to help us out here, so we'll see you next time. So fast forward, now we're in 1775. Again, y'all know about this part. Kind of the shot heard round a world, the first big major battle of the Revolutionary War, called the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So essentially British troops heard that there was a kind of weapons storage facility in Concord, Massachusetts, and so they were kind of marching to Concord in order to seize all of those weapons, to kind of disempower the colonists from their revolutionary purposes. So, of course, the mythology of Paul Revere, heard about the British coming to seize those weapons, and he started riding through the town saying, the British are coming. That actually didn't happen. We can thank an American poet who wrote the poem Paul Revere's Ride for, kind of creating this mythology for us. Paul Revere was a real guy, and he was part of a system of kind of colonial spies at the time called the Sons of Liberty. So he was very integral that night in warning everyone about this impending march to Concord. However, there were several other people who helped along the way in this network, the Sons of Liberty. So Paul Revere actually was arrested pretty early on in the night. So we can actually thank a guy named like William Dawes and Samuel Prescott for continuing the warning sound throughout Massachusetts. All right, so enough of that. Lots of skirmishes broke out between the colonial and British forces. The battle actually started with 77 colonial militiamen facing 700 British troops. Pretty courageous feat right there. But soon enough, the word kept getting out thanks to the Sons of Liberty, and eventually there were 2,000 colonial militia confronting the 700 redcoats, excuse me. So the British eventually, they were like, okay, we're outnumbered, let's run. So it was kind of a major kind of battle and victory, early victory for the colonists. Now, 1 month after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, May 1775, we get the Second Continental Congress. Georgia attends this one. So Congress here drafted what we call the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. And it essentially listed out all the reasons that the colonists were fed up. This is, you can think of it, I guess, as a rough draft for the Declaration of Independence. The year of skirmishes continued. You know, they sent King George the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, and he pretty much ignored it and thought that the colonists were being, ungrateful to his great benevolence. And so, because the Parliament and the King weren't really, relenting, eventually in July 1776, the Continental Congress declared American independence, and a couple days later they signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. Now, they declared independence, so they're like, oh geez, we have to figure out what our government's going to be now. So they started to write the Articles of Confederation. A lot of push and pull. What should our new government be like? We obviously are very discouraged by, the government of Great Britain that's been ruling over us with tyranny. So they went about writing our Articles of Confederation. It was eventually accepted by the Continental Congress in November 1777, and then submitted to each individual state for ratification. So by 1779, 12 of the 13 colonies had ratified it. Maryland was the holdout, and a lot of states, because a lot of states were claiming lands west of Appalachia at the time, Maryland thought that the land should be held by the national government as like a public trust, but other states, wanted the land for themselves. There's a big, back and forth over this, and finally, eventually, Maryland ratified the Articles in 1781. So, the Articles of Confederation. Basically, our Continental Congress, they knew that they wanted the people to have some say in their government, right? They had just thrown off, well, we were in the midst of still fighting a war, of throwing off this form of government where they didn't have any say in their representation. So they knew the new government was going to be a republic, or a representative democracy where the people would have a vote in their elected officials. But they also had worries that a nation as large as ours couldn't be ruled effectively as a republic. And they were very, very scared of like a strong central government. They didn't want anything that like even mirrored or made them think of, the monarchy from Great Britain. So a lot of kind of issues and negotiations that went on in the creation, first in the Articles of Confederation and then the Constitution. So they agreed, okay, we're going to create a form of government where, we're kind of loosely affiliated with each other as a nation, but all of the states are going to maintain, a lot of power, almost more power, actually, yes, more power than the federal government. So the states kind of remained very independent, self-governing, and the national government was almost like subservient to the states in this original document. So the Articles of Confederation, first off, I don't have this on this slide, but there was no executive branch here. There was no such thing as a president in our Articles of Confederation, because again, they were very hesitant and distrustful of any kind of strong, centralized federal government or form of authority. So the Articles, they were a good first step toward this new independent government, but there were a lot of weaknesses that were evident pretty quickly after it was ratified. First and foremost, the Articles of Confederation did not provide any power for the national government to impose taxes. Only the state governments could tax their citizens, and if the national government needed money, they had to go to each individual state governor or legislature and say, please, can I have some money, please? And it was up to each state, yes or no, which is kind of disempowering for your national government. And again, as I said earlier, every war usually results in some debts that need to be owed. So the national government was in quite a bit of debt from money that they had and weapons they had borrowed to fight the Revolutionary War, and they kind of needed money, and they kind of needed to tax their citizens to pay back that debt. That was one thing. There was a federal currency, the continental currency, but nobody wanted to use it. Every state had its own currency, and most of the citizens were much more trustful and willing to use their more localized currency than the new national governments. The national government also did not have the power to impose tariffs on imports from foreign countries, and it could not regulate interstate commerce. And also very importantly, the national government could declare war, but they didn't have a military to speak of. So they had to, kind of like the taxes thing, they had to go to each state and say, can you please give us some soldiers so we can go to war? We would like to declare war, but I don't have anyone to fight it. So those were some major kind of weaknesses that were immediately evident with the Articles of Confederation. This brings us to kind of the culmination of those weaknesses in something that happened in 1786 and into 1787 that we call today Shays' Rebellion. We call it that. There were a lot of people and leaders in this rebellion, but one kind of notable leader was a Revolutionary War veteran and farmer named Daniel Shays. So, what happened was, during, the 8 years, more or less, of the Revolutionary War, most of the people who fought this war for our independence were normal people, poor farmers, yeoman farmers, and a lot of them left their farms behind for many years, left it with their wives and daughters or very young sons or very old, parents to tend to their farms while they went off to fight this war for our freedom. So then, Revolutionary War coming to a close, they go back home, back to their farms, back to their families, and if they were lucky enough to get through the war alive, of course. And they come back home, and all of a sudden, like I said before, wars create a lot of debt. Massachusetts was in a lot of debt in and of itself, and so the governor and the legislature at the time, well, they started to raise taxes on their citizens in Massachusetts. A lot of those taxes ultimately ended up in a lot of these farmers and former veterans from the war that was just fought, landing themselves in a lot of debt. A lot of debt resulted in these farmers' farms and homes being foreclosed upon and seized from them by the government. The government was also putting a lot of these farmers and former veterans into debtors' jails. So you can imagine the grievances that a lot of these men in particular and their families had. They had just fought this war in pursuit of freedom and independence and our life, liberty, and property for 8 years, and put their lives on the line, possibly lost many friends, family members. They go back home, and all of a sudden, life is almost worse than it was before this whole war happened. The taxes in Massachusetts at the time were actually higher than the taxes before the Revolutionary War under the British. So they were like, what is this about? Which brings us to the rebellion. So a lot of these farmers and former Revolutionary War veterans got together, started meeting, realizing that they were, all being in many ways like persecuted by this new state government. And there were a lot of protests, demonstrations against the government. There were marches. They disrupted, state courts. They would block the doors to the courts. They would, occupy the government buildings. And a lot of those rebels were publicly executed by the government, if not, thrown into prison. So here we come. Let's bring it back to the Articles of Confederation and its weaknesses. So the governor of Massachusetts was like, oh gosh, state of emergency. All these farmers and veterans are rising up against us. How are we going to stick together? What are we going to do? I need an army to fight back. But the militia of Massachusetts was not very big at the time. And a lot of the militia had actually left to go be part of the rebellion. So the governor was like, oh gosh, I need help. He wrote to George Washington, please send anyone, send somebody. Washington was like, sorry, we don't have anybody. We don't have a military. There's no one to send to you. So the governor was like, oh gosh, okay, let me go to all the rich people in town or in my state, all the wealthy business owners, because it's in their interest that, we have a functioning government and state. So he asked them for money so that he could go and buy mercenaries, essentially, paid fighters, to come help fight these rebels from Shays' Rebellion. So ultimately, after he paid his mercenaries and this to come fight Daniel Shays and his followers here, ultimately they were suppressed and the fight ended. And actually, during the next election in Massachusetts, that Governor Bowdoin was voted out of power and replaced with John Hancock, who was very much more sympathetic toward the rebels, and so he freed a bunch of them from prison and forgave a lot of their debt, etc. So things ended up okay in the end for those of them that weren't executed by the previous governor. However, to bring this all full circle, Shays' Rebellion ultimately highlighted the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, particularly the fact that we didn't have a national military to call upon in times of distress for the states. So the conclusion kind of quickly thereafter Shays' Rebellion was, okay, The Articles of Confederation needs to be revised. Maybe we need a bit of a stronger central government. Maybe we went a little bit too far, taking away the power from our national government, which led to the Constitutional Convention. So the original intention at this convention was actually to just revise the Articles of Confederation, just tweak it here and there. But pretty soon into the meeting, they were like, yeah, maybe we just need to start from scratch. So they kind of threw it into the trash and they were like, starting over. So May 1787, they essentially decided we're going to create a whole new government, and we have to address a lot of those issues that were arising under the Articles prior. So the convention was attended by 55 delegates at the time, and it addressed a lot of issues here, which we'll come back to. They wanted to strengthen the national government, but also make sure it wasn't too strong. They wanted to create a society where we had law and order, but we also had individual rights and liberties. They wanted all free men to have rights, but also feared mob rule. They didn't want smaller states to be overrun by the bigger states, population-wise. Slavery was an ever-present issue. And kind of the one thing that wasn't a big debate or a source of contention was that everybody liked George. George Washington, famous general from the American Revolution, and he was elected the president of the Constitutional Convention, which pretty much meant he led the writing of the Constitution, and he helped to facilitate a lot of the negotiations that went on here. So a few main issues we're going to highlight is first the question of representation. Small states versus large states, population-wise, not area-wise. So delegates from more populous states, so states with more people like Virginia and New York, they were in favor of a bicameral legislature. So a legislative branch that has two houses. And they said that each house, each state's representation should be based on its population, which of course Virginia and New York want that because it would favor them greatly. On the other hand, the New Jersey plan, which was proposed by New Jersey and Delaware, and other less populous states, they were like, yeah, we don't like that, because we don't have as many people. So we think we should just have a unicameral legislature, just one house, and everybody should be equal. Every state should just have one vote. So there's 13 states, and we'll just have 13, representatives in our legislature, one from each state. Of course, the larger states were like, yeah, no, that's not going to work because we represent a lot more people than you do, and that doesn't really seem fair to us. More on that later. The second big issue we're going to look at is the issue of slavery and freedom. So, in the 1860s, when the Civil War broke out under President Lincoln, it didn't just pop out of nowhere. A lot of the seeds of the Civil War were planted way back here, even going back further, during the Declaration of Independence, and even before that, honestly. So a big contention in writing the Constitution was, how do we deal with, this institution of slavery? There were already, strong abolitionist movements across, the northern states, and of course the South. It was integral to, the way of life and the agricultural system, and so this led to a lot of contention as well, especially when it came to representation. Another big issue, this one's already been noted, was between federal supremacy and versus state sovereignty. How are we going to balance the two? We don't want too strong of a national government, but definitely needs to be stronger than under the Articles. And, states still want to retain a good amount of autonomy and power for themselves as well. They don't want to just be overruled by the federal government at every step. Another big contention, and this kind of goes back to John Locke here, right, is balancing that social contract. How much of our individual liberties are we willing to give up for social stability? So a balance between, sacrificing, some of our rights, maybe some of our freedoms, in exchange for law and order in our society, in our nation. So, what were the decisions that were made here? So we'll go back to the first big issue between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. Remember, the more populous states wanted a bicameral legislature where each house was determined by your state's population. The smaller states, like New Jersey, wanted a unicameral legislature where every state just had one vote. Everyone was equal, no matter how many people you had in your state. So, William Sherman of Connecticut at the time, he was kind of the main facilitator between these two plans. And he sat down and kind of got everyone to come to a middle ground. So we call this the Great Compromise. It also has two other names, the Sherman Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. So pick your favorite one. If you're taking my class, then remember the Great Compromise for quiz purposes and exam. Okay, so what was this compromise all about? What did they come to? What agreement did they come to? So they decided, as we have today, that Congress would be divided into two houses, meaning we have a bicameral legislature. We have a Senate, the upper house of our legislature, and we have the House of Representatives, the lower house. In the Senate, just as it is today, every state has 2 senators. So there is equality of representation for each state in the Senate. At this time, there were 13 colonies, so the first Senate had 26 senators, each state having 2. And that doesn't matter how large or small your population is. So even think of today, a state like California has 2 senators, and a state like Wyoming has 2 senators. No matter how many people live there, every state is equal in the Senate. And our Senate, it was decided our Senate and senators would serve a 6-year term. For the House of Representatives, this one kind of made the Virginia, the larger population states, a little more happy. In the House of Representatives, your representation is determined by your state's population. So the larger number of people you have living in your state, the more representation you get in the House, in the lower house of our legislature. And it was determined that each House member would serve a 2-year term. They also decided at this time that the Congress, our federal government, was going to have some explicit powers granted to them. A lot of these address those weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So Congress is granted the power to tax, maintain an army and a navy, regulate trade and commerce, coin and borrow money, grant patents and copyrights, declare war, and establish laws regulating naturalization or immigration and bankruptcy. All right, now on to the second big compromise that has to do more with the debate over slavery in the writing of the Constitution. So the previous compromise, the Great Compromise, if you remember, the House of Representatives is determined by, your representation in the House is determined by your state's population. So the next question was, especially coming from the southern states, well, who do we get to count in our population? When we take a census of our population in our state, can we count the slave population? Of course, southern states were very adamant that slaves would be counted, especially since a lot of the southern states, particularly I know Georgia at the time, if you counted every human being in the state, it was about half, white slave owners and poor white citizens, and half slave population. So if you were going to not allow the slave population to be counted, that would cut the southern states' representation by half, potentially. So of course the South was fighting to count their slave population in their numbers. However, of course, the northern states argued that's not really fair. It's called the House of Representatives, and your slave population doesn't have the right to vote. You don't view them as citizens. You view them as property. And so I think it's a little far-fetched to argue that you are representing them or their interests. So this was kind of a major contention between the South and the North. And of course, the northern states also wanted to retain more representation in the House as well. So another compromise was made, pretty dark in our history, but the resolution to this that I don't think made either side happy, but they were both just like fine. It was decided that the southern states, the slaveholding states, would be allowed to count all of their free population, including free African Americans, as well as 60% or 3/5 of their slave population. So for every 5 slaves that they counted, only 3 got to count in the official census, which again determined how many representatives they got in the legislature of the House. All right, so on to another issue. How did they balance making sure that the federal government wouldn't be too powerful? And this is where we have kind of the introduction of our separation of powers. So they split us into 3 branches of government here at the federal level. Y'all have been learning this, hopefully, since you were in like the 3rd grade. But a quick recap, we ended up with 3 branches. We got the Congress with the Senate and the House of Representatives, a bicameral Congress, and this constitutes our legislative branch. They make the laws, right? We got the president, and he, or well, maybe she one day, constitutes our executive branch. And we have the Supreme Court, which constitutes our judicial branch. And the idea of splitting up our federal government into these 3 branches was that each branch would have the ability to provide a check on the other branch's power. And in that way, no one could ever become, so to speak, like a tyrant, as they often saw, in the British monarchy, with somebody just making crazy decisions day in, day out. There would be some sort of check on their power. So for instance, right, Congress can pass the laws, they're the legislative branch, but the president has a check on that. The president has the power to veto legislation. Of course, Congress can override a veto if they get enough votes to override it. You also have the power of judicial review in the Supreme Court. That was kind of made official in 1803, whereas today a lot of cases that come before the Supreme Court are cases that rule on whether a law is constitutional or not. So the Supreme Court essentially has a check on the legislature. President is limited because the Congress has to declare war. They have to provide funding to the military and approve the military budget every 2 years. And Congress, notably, also has the power to impeach a president. The president can appoint Supreme Court and federal justices and judges. They can appoint ambassadors. However, the Senate has to advise and consent and approve of all of those justices, judges, and ambassadors. And all treaties signed by the president also have to be approved by the Senate. So we're going to talk about this a lot more in Chapter 3, but essentially in our federal system of government, power is divided between the national government and the state governments. And to a very large extent, especially in the writing of our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the founders really tried to create like a system where the states still retained a good amount of independence from the federal government. So there are some things listed in our Constitution that we call the enumerative powers. These are powers of the national government, and they are only powers of the national government. State governments cannot do these things. For instance, the national government has the authority to declare war, impose federal taxes, coin and regulate currency, regulate commerce between states and internationally, raise and maintain a military, maintain a post office, make treaties with foreign nations and Native American tribes, and make laws regarding naturalization. So these are, if you open up your Constitution link, that's provided in Blackboard for you in the supplemental readings area, you will see in Article 1, all of these things are listed out explicitly, clearly for all to see. So this is why we call them the enumerative powers. Now, it was assumed, especially early on, that anything that was not listed in there in Article 1, those are rights and powers that are reserved for the states, the state governments. So there's nothing in the Constitution about regulating drug use or marriage law and divorce law. So the states essentially have the power to regulate those things, at least during the time of the writing of the Constitution. We'll get into some nuances of that in later chapters. The states can also regulate commerce within their own state, and they can impose state taxes. So there's still a good amount of leeway and freedom for states to, make legislation as they see fit for their own state and its citizens, as long as they don't overstep their bounds and try to do something that is within the federal powers. So states have a degree of sovereignty. However, there is a clause in the Constitution, we call it the Supremacy Clause, which essentially says that the Constitution and any laws or treaties made by the federal government kind of supersede state laws. They are the supreme law of the land. Here's a quote. So this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. All right, so the Constitution, it's written. We had a lot of negotiations. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't pretty, but they got to a final draft eventually, and in September 17th, 1787, the delegates voted to approve the document they had drafted over many, many hard-won months. However, if you read kind of toward the end of the Constitution, it says, just because we've written this and we agree to it here in Philadelphia, that doesn't mean it's final. Now the Constitution is going to go back to each individual state the people of each state are going to kind of hold their own convention on whether or not they want to agree to this Constitution, and they're going to vote for delegates who will go to this state level convention and make this vote, yay or nay. So during this whole process, there were a lot of criticisms that rose up. A lot of people were not happy with this office of the president. That wasn't in existence under the Articles of Confederation. They were like a little bit suspicious of this new executive branch. They thought maybe there was a bit too much power being put into the hands of one, individual. A lot of people did not like the idea of the federal government having the right to tax. Many thought the new judicial system, the Supreme Court, was going to be a little bit too far away from the people who were being tried, because, you should have a jury of your peers, and if you're traveling from Georgia to Philadelphia or New York, that's a pretty far way away from your peers. And the biggest source of contention from people who were looking at this Constitution was that, and if you read the Constitution, you'll notice there's really no mention of citizens or their rights or liberties. So all of those natural rights that John Locke and many of our founders were very concerned about, they were really absent from our Constitution. And this made a lot of people very uneasy. So a lot of opponents were like, we need to add quite a bit to this document. We need a Bill of Rights. So as people were starting to read this Constitution that had been drafted, there was a sorting process. People started to fall into two big groups, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists tended to be more wealthy. They tended to be Northerners, by and large. They were in business and industry. Also take note that this is all happening alongside the Industrial Revolutionary period, where people were starting to work in factories a lot more, produce goods for the mass market. There are a lot of changes going on in the economy more generally, and forces of production. So the Federalists tended to be supportive of the Industrial Revolution more generally as well. And there were a lot of military commanders in there too. So they wanted kind of a strong central government. They thought it would be better for defense and better for growth. The Anti-Federalists tended to be less monetarily powerful. They tended to be, by and large, more from like southern states, and they wanted to retain more power for the state governments. They did not trust elites. They didn't want a strong central government, and they thought power should rest in the hands of small land-owning farmers of average wealth. So the seeds were planted for the Federalist and Anti-Federalist parties, which we'll get to in time here in this class. But within a few months, some states started to ratify the Constitution. Remember, they only need 9 of 13 to make it official. So at first we get Delaware, number 1, at the end of 1787, pretty quickly followed by Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Georgia. Then in 1788, we get Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, and New Hampshire. And once New Hampshire ratified it, well, you had 9 of the 13 colonies having ratified the Constitution. So when New Hampshire ratified it on June 21st, 1788, that made the Constitution official. But the other states, they still went about with their ratification process. So Virginia ended up ratifying it just a few days after New Hampshire. New York the following month, and then followed up by North Carolina in 1789. And then, Rhode Island was pretty obstinate. They had a lot of problems with this Constitution for various reasons. The Bill of Rights being absent. They didn't really like the idea of like a federal currency or the federal ability to tax. But eventually they did get enough votes to ratify the Constitution in Rhode Island, and they ratified it at the end of May in 1790. Now, toward the end of the Constitution, there is a procedure included for changing the Constitution or adding something to the Constitution. So this is all about the amendment process. And this kind of creates an avenue so that our Constitution can be what we call, like a living document. It's a good framework for a form of government, but, and as we'll see, in the weeks to come here, and as I've already mentioned, there's no Bill of Rights in there. So the first 10 amendments to our Constitution were kind of to guarantee liberties and rights to the people. So we can, or our legislatures can change the Constitution over time. So an amendment can be proposed in two different ways. And possibly passed. So an amendment can first be proposed by the Congress and the legislative branch. If this happens, 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate must approve of the amendment. And if that happens, then it will be sent to all of the state legislatures, who also have to vote on it. And if 3/4 of those legislatures approve, then it becomes official law. An amendment to the Constitution. There is a second way that amendments can be proposed. This way has actually never happened in U.S. history so far, but amendments can also be proposed by the states. So if 2/3 of all the states support an amendment, then Congress is required to bring that amendment to the floor and vote on it. And then kind of the whole process starts back at number 1, 2/3 of your House, 2/3 of your Senate has to approve it, and then it would go back to the states to be voted on, and 3/4 of the states would have to agree. So as you can see, the framers made changing our Constitution possible, but it's definitely not an easy process either way. So since 1789, the Constitution has only been amended 27 times. I believe there have been like over 11,000 amendments proposed, and only 27 of them made it to the finish line. So it's hard to do, but it is possible. But our founders didn't want, our Constitution just changing every year, every 2 years, every 4 years. And so they made it difficult enough that if it was going to be changed, you really needed a lot of support. So as I noted, the first 10 amendments were very quickly added after the Constitution was ratified. I said Rhode Island didn't ratify until 1790, and the Bill of Rights was added in 1791. So the Bill of Rights, for a lot of the states who ratified it, it was kind of like a condition. They were like, we will ratify this Constitution, but only if there is going to be a Bill of Rights quickly added. So this did happen. James Madison went about writing 19 different amendments, which were submitted to the Congress, and 10 of those were voted into official law. Now, in chapter 4, we are going to pick apart every single one of these first 10 amendments in our Bill of Rights, phrase by phrase, word by word. So a lot more on this to come in a couple chapters down the road. But for now, let's just read through our Bill of Rights here. So Amendment number 1, probably the most well-known, covers several different rights. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Amendment 2, the right to bear arms. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Amendment 3, housing of soldiers. Remember this from Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Number 4, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Number 5, there's a lot in this one. More on that in chapter 4. But for now, we shall read the text. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime, unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces, or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Number 6, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have assistance of counsel for his defense. Number 7, in suits at common law where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. Number 8, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Number 9, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And the last amendment in our Bill of Rights, number 10, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. So those are the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, which we call the Bill of Rights. Much more, I have an entire chapter on that in chapter 4. But I'm also just going to point out some other notable amendments that have been passed over time here. And some fun facts for you. Of all of the amendments, only one of them repealed another amendment, and that one had to do with prohibition when they banned alcohol in the country for a few years. The 18th Amendment banned alcohol and sale and consumption, and the 21st Amendment kind of undid the 18th one. Other amendments that have rectified problems in our country: the 17th Amendment gave voters the right to directly elect their U.S. senators. So in the original Constitution as written, way back when in the 1700s, the original plan for the Senate was that your U.S. senators would be appointed by your state legislature. So in 1913, they kind of flipped that back and gave voters the direct power to, go to the voting booth and elect the senator that you want. The 20th Amendment in 1933 moved the date of the presidential inauguration from March to January, because the election's in November, and the thought was, maybe we need to have our president take office a little bit more quickly. Way back when the country was founded, everybody was riding on horseback and horse and buggies, and so it maybe made more sense to have the inauguration in March, to give the president like 4 months to get moved in. But with airplanes and trains and cars, etc., we didn't really require so much time. The 22nd Amendment in 1955, more on this in a later chapter, but FDR was president elected kind of in the midst of the Great Depression, and he was a relatively popular president. He was reelected 3 times, so he was a 4-term president. But his detractors, did think that his term was a little bit too long. So in 1955, this 22nd Amendment was passed, which limited a president to 2 terms in office, so a max of 8 years. The 27th Amendment, our last amendment that was passed in 1992, regulates how Congress can increase their salary. And then 4 important amendments when it comes to equal rights. More on this in Chapter 5. But the 13th Amendment, 1865, just following up right on the heels of the Civil War, abolished slavery in the United States. A few years later, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to African Americans and guaranteed equal protection under the law, no matter your race or color. It also banned states from depriving any of their citizens the rights to life, liberty, and property. The 15th Amendment gave all men the right to vote, regardless of their race or color. And the 19th Amendment, about 50 years later, gave women the right to vote. Just a few more for you. The 23rd Amendment allowed residents of Washington, D.C. to vote for president. They could not vote for president prior to that, people who lived in our capital. The 24th Amendment in 1964 abolished poll taxes. A lot more on poll taxes in Chapter 5. And 26th Amendment in 1971, this was during the Vietnam War and the draft. So this reduced the voting age from 21 to 18 because there were 18-year-olds being drafted and sent off to fight the war. And the argument was, if you are old enough to fight and possibly die for your country, you should most definitely be granted the right to vote for your legislators. So that brings us to the end of Chapter 2, a little overview of the history, historical context for John Locke, the Magna Carta, where our founders got a lot of their ideas for these natural rights to life, liberty, and property. The all of the catalysts for the American Revolution in the first place. The rough draft of our Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, along with its weaknesses and Shays' Rebellion, and then the constitutional conventions, the writing of the Constitution, and the several different kind of points of contention that a lot of our founders had in writing it, and the negotiations that were made to produce this social contract. Again, the oldest and one of the shortest written constitutions that's still in effect today. There's over 200, I think, constitutions that are written constitutions in effect in our world presently, and the United States Constitution really kind of set the standard for a lot of that. So it's not perfect. No form of government is, and we'll get into a lot of those imperfections throughout the other chapters in this class. But it has stood the test of time thus far. All right, well, that is the end of chapter 2, and I'll see you back here next time for chapter 3 when we talk about federalism and anti-federalism. All right, have a great day. Bye.